Hello, everyone. That was a brilliant introduction. It gives you a bit of my background. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is really a kind of big picture overview of my own research. And my own research focuses on the Neolithic and the Early Bronze Age in Britain and Ireland. And for many years, I worked on a project to create a new visitor centre for Stonehenge. I was involved for many years in how Stonehenge is managed and presented to the public, and I'm very happy to answer questions about that, perhaps at the end, if you have anything burning that you want to ask about the sort of heritage management of the site. But for now, this talk is fairly archaeological in that it's going to focus on a key transition right at the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Metal Age in Britain and Ireland. Hang on, let me just make sure I'm on the right screen. So this is the period that I'm going to be talking about. And when I'm talking about these dates, I'm really talking about Britain, because this transition happens at different dates throughout the world, the arrival of the first metallurgy. And in Europe, it happens at different times in different places. So this is the period right at the end of the Stone Age, the period that in Britain we call the Neolithic. And we have this slightly odd transition period where for about 200, maybe 300 years, we've got a bit of a crossover, a sort of early pioneering part of the beginnings of metallurgy. So the late Neolithic can be characterized by the construction of major monuments, very large structures like Stonehenge. We don't know what people are doing with their dead. Whatever they're doing with their dead, it means that they're archaeologically invisible. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. We don't really have that much evidence for how people were living in terms of the settlements and their houses, but there are exceptions to this, which I'll come on to. And we think that people at this stage, although they have the ability to farm crops and they've been keeping domestic animals for a couple of thousand years by this point, these seem to be highly mobile communities who lead a kind of nomadic or pastoral lifestyle. So they're following their herds of cattle. They've got sheep and pigs as well, but it seems that that's more important than growing crops and being settled permanently in one place. In this middle period, this transition, we get the arrival of the first metals into Britain, so particularly copper and gold. And these come with new people that arrive from continental Europe across the English Channel at this stage. And we get a complete shift in what people are doing with their dead. So they start to bury people in individual graves with grave goods and sometimes under barrows. And we have a new type of pottery that you can see at the top of the page there, beaker pottery, these kind of very distinctive drinking cups, so often highly decorated, quite finely made. And this period tends to be known sometimes as the beaker period, and sometimes the people are known as the beaker people, but I'll come on to whether that's an appropriate term a bit later. And then in the early Bronze Age, we really have a ceasing or a lack of major monuments. So big things are not built anymore, large henges and stone circles. People bury their dead, selected dead, I should say, under barrows or round mounds, so burial mounds. Similarities though, we still really don't know where people are living. We don't really get permanent settlements until the Middle Bronze Age, so a little bit later. And we still think, therefore, that people are quite mobile and moving around with their herds of cattle. But of course, we've got bronze working. So very shortly after the first copper arrives in Britain, people start to exploit tin sources in Western and Southwestern Britain particularly, and creating bronze, which then spreads backwards across to the rest of Europe in the opposite direction, and bronze working spreads from Britain in that direction. So this is the period that I research, and I particularly use radiocarbon dating to try and pinpoint the precise chronology of when these events are happening, because as you can see, it's quite a short time period and there's a lot going on, and trying to map that transition and work out what's going on is really fascinating. So my PhD research, which I finished and completed in 2022, was focused on something called monument complexes. And I've just selected highlight some of the major monument complexes here on a map of Britain and Ireland. These monument complexes are basically clusters of monuments. So regions where more than normal, we get clusterings of things like earth monuments, stone circles, timber circles. So, for example, at Dorchester-on-Thames, which is not far from Oxford in central England, this is a henge monument. It's called Big Rings, and it's a whole cluster of monuments, including a cursus, which is a great big rectangular enclosure, and lots of other monuments clustered next to the River Thames. Here in the Walton Basin, another one that perhaps isn't so well known. Partly these ones are not so well known because they've either been ploughed out or quarried away. More henge monuments, great big palisaded enclosures, which are huge, great big timber circular monuments. Up in Yorkshire, the Thornborough henges, these three identical henges laid out in an area with other cursus monuments and pit alignments. Up in Scotland, here's Forteviot, which is a great big timber palisaded enclosure, hundreds and thousands of posts and lots of other smaller monuments associated. Up here in Orkney, one that you might be more familiar with, this is a photograph of the Ring of Brodgar, which is one of the monuments that cluster on the mainland of the Orkney Islands, where there's a series of stone circles and major settlements. And finally, over in Ireland, in what's known as the Boyne Valley or the Bend of the Boyne River, where we've got a cluster of passage tombs, including the famous Newgrange. So you can see that there are parts of the country that have particular clusters of monuments and parts of the country that really don't. There are empty gaps. And my PhD research was really trying to answer the question of why. Why do monuments cluster in certain places? What is it about those particular places that draws people to them again and again over time? I should say that these monuments are built over the whole period of the Neolithic and sometimes into the early Bronze Age too. So what is it that makes people go back to these places and build more monuments again and again over time? And how can we construct kind of biographies for these clusters, these complexes, so mapping what happens in detail over time? So I'm going to talk today about so I'm going to use two case studies, the Stonehenge landscape and the Dorchester landscape. And as you can see, there's a bit distinct cluster of these monument complexes down in southern England, what you might have been referred to as Wessex. And this is a series of clusters of monuments that are on the Chalk Downs. This is Stanton Drew, which is not far from where I live in Bristol, a series of amazing stone circles and timber structures. Pretty circles on the Mendip Hills, four enormous, great big early henge type monuments. We have a lot of monuments on the Cranbourne Chase, including this, which is the longest cursus monument. A cursus is a great big rectangular enclosure. This one stretches for 10 kilometres across the landscape. And slightly more famous ones, Avebury with its stone circle and henge monuments, Silbury Hill, all kinds of other clusters of monuments there. Marden, which is just between Avebury and Stonehenge, a huge, another what we call mega henge with lots of other monuments. And of course, Stonehenge. Stonehenge itself at the centre of a whole cluster of really important monuments. And down here on the south coast, or not far from the south coast, is the Dorchester complex that I'll come on to later. So let's start with Stonehenge. I'm hoping that this photograph is a familiar sight to many of you. You may have been to visit, you may have read papers about this monument, kind of globally famous. It's the only stone circle that we know of in the world that has lintels, which are the horizontal stones connecting the vertical stones. And it's also unique in the way that the stones have been shaped and worked into joints. So you might be able to just see at the top of this stone here, there's a little bump. This is the mortise and tenon joints. It's basically woodworking joints that have been used to connect together the stones. And it's a monument that's had huge amounts written about it, and it's a World Heritage Site, globally famous. But it's all not just one phase. The monument's actually quite complicated. This aerial photograph shows really nicely the stones in the centre of the monument, but they were not the first part of the site to be constructed. The first part of the site was this earthwork circular enclosure that you can see picked out quite nicely here in the low sunlight. And it's about 100 metres in diameter. It consists of a ditch and two banks on either side. It has quite a large entrance causeway, which is where you're looking across in the nearest part of the photograph here. And this was constructed around about 3000 BC, possibly 2900 BC. It was a monument that existed for about 500 years before the Sarsens and the bluestones were put up in the centre of the monument here. This early phase of the monument is really important because it's when about an estimated 150 people were buried here as cremated remains, and they were placed into a series of pits, 56 pits, that were dug just inside the bank on the inner side here, in a perfect circle. Stonehenge is famous for its astronomical alignments. It is aligned, the stone circle is aligned very precisely on the movements of the sun. So if you stand in the middle of Stonehenge and look outwards towards the northeast, as this photograph is showing, the sun rises over the outlying heel stone. That is the small stone that you can see in the distance there between the other stones. And conversely, if you stand in the centre of Stonehenge on Midwinter's Day, the shortest day of the year, and look in the opposite direction, you will see the midwinter sunset set between, well, originally it would have set between two standing stones at the head of the horseshoe. So the stone circle, would have had a complete stone circle here of 30 uprights and 30 lintels, and then inside is this horseshoe of the largest sarsen stones. So a trilithon, two upright stones with a horizontal lintel, and the tallest one was here at the top of the head of the horseshoe, and the sun would have set between those two standing stones. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that today because one of the stones and its lintel has fallen down, so we don't quite get the full effect, but that's the key set of alignments. And this has led us to interpret Stonehenge as a prehistoric temple, aligned with the movements of the sun. There's not many other clues about what Stonehenge meant and how it functioned, although it is part of a much bigger tradition of building monuments like this, but typically built out of timber or wood rather than stone. So the Stonehenge landscape is really interesting. This is a map of the area. You can see that the river wiggling through there, that's the River Avon, which flows southwards towards the south coast. And this map shows you all of the monuments in the area that date from the early Neolithic, so the time before Stonehenge was constructed. You can see that we've got two Cursus monuments, these great big rectangular enclosures defined by a bank and a ditch, one known as the Greater Cursus and a smaller one known as the Lesser Cursus. Cursus monuments are a real mystery. We don't actually know why they were constructed. When they get excavated by archaeologists, there are very few finds. Pretty much the only thing that gets found are the antler picks used to dig the ditches, which is great for dating, but not really for understanding how they were used. It's been suggested that they are monumentalized routeways across the landscape, or that they're some sort of way of corralling cattle together, perhaps even kind of race courses, as in places where you would prove yourself as a young person and do archery and running and things. They're called Cursus monuments because of William Stukely, who was an antiquarian, who named them, he thought they were Roman chariot racing circuses. So Circus Cursus, that's where the name comes from. And in fact, the Stonehenge Greater Cursus was the first one that was identified. It was Stukely 300 years ago or so who saw the earthworks and said that that's what he thought it was. The rest of the little purple blobs you can see on this map are long barrows, so burial monuments, long mounds, not usually with the stone chamber, but sometimes. And the little stars you can see are evidence for where we have settlement from this period. So pits, for example, with pottery from this period, evidence of domestic settlement. We don't really have any houses from this period, but the pits give us an indication of where people are settled. The other major thing we have in this landscape are two causewayed enclosures, one right up here called Robin Hood's Ball, and one here at Lark Hill that's only recently been discovered when new housing has been built. This is all an army area, so it's housing for troops. And the presence of a pair of causewayed enclosures is really rare. Causewayed enclosures are areas of land surrounded by segmented or sort of separated segments of ditch. And they're thought to be early Neolithic gathering places, so where people might gather together for exchange of goods, to exchange ideas, to conduct rituals. Sometimes these sites have burials. And we've got now two in this landscape, which is really exciting. So you can see that the Stonehenge landscape is really important in the early Neolithic period already, before anybody thinks about starting to build Stonehenge. So it's an early Neolithic monument complex, two causewayed enclosures, two Cursus monuments, and a scatter of long barrows. This is what Robin Hood's Ball looks like today. from the air. You can see those sort of slightly odd looking irregular segmented ditches that form the causewayed enclosure. And here is an aerial view of the Cursus monument. You can see the banks and the ditches here running all the way along. It's about just over a kilometre in length. I should say that this is one of the very few Cursus monuments. There are about 300 or so known across Britain now. It's one of the very few where there are still upstanding earthworks. Most of them are known through aerial photography or geophysics or excavation. And the scatter of long barrows includes examples like this one. This is the long barrow known as Winterbourne Stoke. You can see the sort of oval-shaped mound, which would have had ditches on each side. And this little chunk taken out was an antiquarian excavation by John Thurnham in the 1870s. In the Middle Neolithic, there's not as much activity happening. It goes a bit quiet. There's still some settlement, as you can see by the stars. But really the only monument that gets built in this period is the first phase of Stonehenge, right here in the middle of Salisbury Plain. And that early enclosure has some similarities to those earlier causewayed enclosures, but it's perfectly circular. It's that earthwork that I was just showing you in the aerial photograph of Stonehenge. And this is what we think it may have looked like. So a ditch with two banks. And within that, 56 pits, these ones known as the Aubrey holes, from which about half of them have been excavated, and cremated remains have been found both within the pits themselves and also adjacent to them, and also a few in the ditch and the bank. Now, archaeologists are not really agreed on whether these were open pits, whether they held timber posts, or whether they held standing stones. Unfortunately, most of them were excavated in the 1920s when records were not kept in particularly great detail. And so it's quite difficult for us to understand the evidence in terms of what these pits held, if anything. And the jury's a bit out on what exactly stood in those holes. But within there, and that it's not shown on the black and white image, but you can see in the image below, were a whole series of timber structures. Unfortunately, again, because of the later modifications to the site, we don't have a very good picture of exactly how these appeared, but we do know there were several timber structures within the enclosure, and these must have been a much more kind of coherent plan if we were able to recover it. The settlement evidence looks like this. So this is a site at West Amesbury where fairly recently some large Middle Neolithic pits were found. So we know that people are living in this landscape. These large pits had pottery and animal bones and even some human remains from this period, which shows that people are, and there's hundreds of these pits across the area. So it's quite densely settled, no houses, but not a huge amount of monument construction going on compared to the previous period. And then we move to the late Neolithic, when you can see there's an explosion of monuments being built across the area. Not only do we have Stonehenge being built properly, as in like the stone circle gets constructed in the middle of Stonehenge, and an avenue is built which links it to the nearby river, the River Avon, where on the banks of the River Avon, at the end of the avenue, there's another small stone circle. But you can see there's a real kind of cluster of activity just to the northeast, an area called Durrington Walls, where there was a whole range of activities. We now know that there was a settlement there, a settlement that was occupied round about the same time that the stones were being erected at Stonehenge, and a series of timber structures, including Woodhenge. And later on, a great big megahenge, a huge bank and ditch were constructed to surround that area of land. You can also see there's a sort of ring or two arcs of pits to the north and south of Durrington Walls, here and here. These have only recently been discovered, and it's such an enormous monument, so people are kind of left scratching their heads about exactly what's happening here. But these are potentially, some of them may be natural sinkholes, but others of them seem to be deliberately dug. They're enormous, great big pits, about 5 meters deep, and they seem to be linked by small rows of stake holes, so sort of fence lines, almost enclosing this whole area of land and this important location.
So we've got a lot going on. We've also got some scatters of settlement. Again, they're the green stars that you can see, and particularly on Boscombe Down at the southwest part of the site, sorry, southeast, in this area, we've got quite a lot of settlement evidence and another pit circle. So Stonehenge by this point looks a bit like this. The stones, the sarsen stones, have been put up in the centre of the site. Whatever stood in the Aubrey holes have been removed, and the heel stone, that outlying stone, has got a little ditch of its own. We've got places like Woodhenge. This is a reconstruction of what the post structures at Woodhenge may have looked like when they were first constructed. So here, these ritual monuments, this is basically Woodhenge is a kind of version of Stonehenge, but made of timber. It has the same alignments towards the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset. But in this area, there's lots and lots of activity going on. Lots of animal bones, lots of pottery, chalk artifacts, all kinds of things that suggest quite intensive occupation. Whereas Stonehenge, conversely, is kept very clean. When archaeologists have excavated the site, there's hardly any finds. There's hardly any pottery. There's no evidence for burning, animal bones, these kind of things. So it's almost like there's two parts to the landscape. One area that's kept fairly clean, perhaps sacred, and another area that's much busier and has settlement and occupation. Here's a reconstruction of what that settlement might have looked like at Durrington Walls. There's some debate about exactly how large this was, but it looks like the settlement, these small houses, about 5 metres by 5 metres, were only occupied for about 50 years or so. So our best guess at the moment is that this is almost like a construction camp. It's where the people lived while they were building the main stone phase of Stonehenge. And absolutely hundreds and hundreds of animal bones have been found from this site, lots of pig and lots of cattle bones, lots and lots of pottery called grooved ware pottery that was used at this time. Such an extent that it suggests that people were feasting at this site. So they're kind of got copious quantities of food. And that particularly seemed to have happened around the midwinter period, which might have been when they were constructing Stonehenge or perhaps when they were gathering for ceremonies at Stonehenge. And here's just one of the other sites in the landscape recently excavated by Wessex Archaeology. You can see the people standing where the posts were of that great big pit circle. Now, in that same series of excavations down there at Boscombe Down to the south of the town of Amesbury, one of the really important discoveries back in 2002 was this particular burial. This is the Amesbury Archer. He became known as the Amesbury Archer. He is the earliest burial that we have from Britain that is accompanied by metal artifacts, and he's only a couple of miles away from Stonehenge. He's a rather extraordinary burial. The photograph there, I apologise for the poor quality of that photograph, but basically this excavation was happening in May 2002, and towards the end of the day, this burial was found on a Friday before a bank holiday weekend. And the excavators got very excited because one of the first things they discovered was a very small piece of gold. And one of the excavators jumped up and down and said, "Gold!" shouted at the top of her voice. Meanwhile, there were some dog walkers and various people passing, and the excavators decided that they needed to excavate this whole burial before the bank holiday weekend. They couldn't risk leaving it unsecured because metal detectorists or somebody might come and damage it or disturb it over the weekend. So they worked late into the night. And the reason this photograph looks a bit weird is because it's lit by the headlights of one of the site vans in order that they could carry on excavating into the darkness. So this excavation revealed a male burial with, I think, 7 beaker pots, a huge number of beaker pots, lots of other equipment and artifacts, flint tools, a copper knife, metalworking tools, a cushion stone, which is another metalworking tool, a wrist guard, so a stone artifact that's found, thought to have been used like an archer's brace, so you would put it on the inside of your arm to prevent bruising from using a bow, and another separate wrist guard, and 2 rather extraordinary gold earrings. I catch up with myself. Yeah, so it's the richest burial that we know of from the early Bronze Age, and it has over 100 different objects. He was a middle-aged man, but he did have some interesting attributes. He had a distinctly knocked about leg, which meant he had would have had a distinct limp when he was walking. And the radiocarbon dates on this particular burial give us an indication that he dies in this period. So this is that Chalcolithic crossover period. I should have said Stonehenge itself, the stone parts of Stonehenge get constructed round about 2500 BC. So he's dying very, very shortly after Stonehenge is constructed. So he may have been somebody who came to this area because he'd heard about this enormous building project, because he'd been attracted by the fame of this extraordinary project. And it's really interesting that he dies and then is buried with all of the attributes of a typical beaker burial, but very close to Stonehenge. Here are some of the artifacts a little bit closer up. These gold earrings are very distinctive. They're like little rolled discs, and they've been discussed as being either earrings or perhaps hair tresses, beard tresses that you would wear. And the barbed and tanged flint arrowheads are very typical of this particular period. And the two wrist guards there that I was talking about, those archers' wrist guards. One of the most important things, as well as the gold earrings, is that there are three copper knives accompanying him. And these are the earliest copper artifacts from Britain. So this is a rather interesting person. Now, this is a bit of a complicated table, but I'm just trying to show you how the dating works. So the first phase of Stonehenge happens around 3000 BC. That's when they have that Dinsham bank, when the Aubrey holes and the cremations in that early phase. Then we have the construction of the main part of Stonehenge, the sarsen stones that you're familiar with. And then we have a few other things happening in the area. But basically we have the beaker burials come in very, very shortly after Stonehenge is constructed, right at the end of the Stone Age. And yes, I've put the dates up again then for when the Amesbury archer died and was buried. So you can see that he's really hot on the heels of when the sarsen stones go up at Stonehenge. So what's all this beaker pottery and all of this about? So beaker pottery is something that is found across Europe. It develops probably in Iberia, in Spain, Portugal, and it sort of melds with an idea of single grave culture that comes across from Central and Northern Europe. And the first ones here that you can see that arrive in Britain come in round about 2400 BC. In fact, I've put there at the dates at the top, the date for the first beaker burials in England. And then very quickly afterwards, there's an explosion of different types, and they spread very rapidly across different parts of Britain and Ireland. But in the initial phase, there's just a few types and only a few of them appearing. And they overlap with the pottery that's being used in Britain at the time, which is called grooved-ware pottery, which is very different. It's large, tub-like, flat-bottomed pots with distinctive decoration. So this early phase is this sort of transition period that I'm talking about. Pioneer beaker. And then it moves on to much more kind of diverse forms of beaker pottery and slightly different and more varied style of burials that happen. So the Amesbury archer, the chap there, was a very interesting person because he was so early in terms of the dates, but also because he had the earliest metal objects so far identified in Britain. And so he was really important in trying to resolve a decades-long debate about how beaker pots had arrived and how metal had arrived in Britain, whether it was the movement of people, often referred to as the beaker folk, or whether it was just simply that artifacts and ideas were moving, but not necessarily people migrating. And so the Amesbury archer was studied, and isotopes from his teeth were looked at, oxygen in particular. And he was identified as coming from Central Europe. So his suggests that somewhere in the region of the Northern Alps or Switzerland, that's where he was born and brought up. But he died over here in the area near Stonehenge. So he grew up in Central Europe, and this was a revelation. This is quite early in the time when isotopes were first being developed as a method for looking at migration. And it indicated that, yes, there are such people, people are moving with these pots. and people are coming over from continental Europe with this new style of pottery with these first metals. And so what happened was a big project called the Beaker People Project was set up. This is the publication that came out of it, where isotopes were looked at for a whole number, hundreds of beaker burials across Britain and Ireland, to see how many people had come across and where those people had come from. So yes, about 300 burials across Britain. But actually, surprisingly, they only found a handful or so of people, first generation migrants, first generation movers from Europe to Britain. The majority of the people were actually born and brought up in Britain, but still buried with beaker pots. But generally, there was quite a lot of mobility. There's quite a lot of people moving over short distances in their lifetimes between different parts of Britain. So that was slightly surprising. So it wasn't really a clear cut all migrants or all adopters. It was a few migrants, a few early people coming across from Europe, but then it's the idea of beaker pottery and the idea of individual burials and the ideas of metal working spread very rapidly. Now, beaker pots come out of this kind of European story, as I said, out of Iberia and Central Europe, and the pots kind of vary depending on which bits of Europe you're from, but in effect, the earliest ones are from the Iberian Peninsula. Another layer of this has come in more recently, which is that DNA evidence is now being applied to these burials. And this has shown us that quite a lot of the people, or almost all of the people who are buried with beaker pots in Britain have ancestry, have DNA that derives from Central and Eastern Europe. So that does suggest that we've got a lot of people coming over and that they're then having children and they preserve this distinct DNA ancestry. Interestingly, these DNA studies have shown that the beaker using people in Iberia were local. So they were people who were farming there in the Neolithic period, and then they adopted beaker pots or developed beaker pots and sort of stayed in the same place. Similarly, in Central Europe, these people using beakers had ancestry deriving from Eastern Europe and the Yamnaya steppe, which is what we know now, kind of agriculture and various things that arrives in that kind of west moving direction. So there are instances in Europe where cultural traits like beaker pots are adopted rather than principally spreading through migration. But in Britain, it is a story of migration. I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but basically this is the kind of spread of this idea that quite a lot of people come out of these, the Yamnaya people, particularly out of these steppe areas of Central Asia, and move gradually across Britain, bringing with them kind of very different ways of living, particularly metal using, but also things like the horse. It's an interesting process and complicated, but in effect, these people eventually end up moving, some of them at least, into Britain. Now, this DNA story, when it was published in 2018, was covered in the New Scientist and various other media outlets, and it was proposed, it was kind of couched in rather dramatic terms. So it was kind of like, the new people coming across were described this way: the story of the most murderous people of all time revealed in ancient DNA. Starting 5,000 years ago, the Yamnaya embarked on a violent conquest of Europe. And here you can see that the artist commissioned by the New Scientist has shown Stonehenge with a hooded figure, perhaps looking out across the landscape. And here on the horizon are these horse riding arrivals, these newcomers, very dramatic, dark sky, showing that this is kind of the end of everything. This is them invading. It's quite a distinct and interesting story that might suggest that the Amesbury Archer was part of these arriving hordes of people. But it's much more complicated than that. Actually, what the DNA evidence shows is that whereas people from the people living here in the Neolithic, so the people here living here and building those cursus monuments and building Stonehenge, they don't have any of this continental ancestry, but all of the people from the early Bronze Age do. So you're thinking, okay, that's good. That shows that there's a whole scale shift in the people that are living in Britain at this time. And the genetic evidence shows a 93% replacement of the gene pool. So a huge, what is this, could be a massive turnover of population, huge shift in the people that are living in the area. And this is shown on kind of visually on this diagram. The blue is the Neolithic ancestry, so the sort of native, they were themselves immigrants from before, but the native people who are living in Britain during the Neolithic, and then after, you can see that big shift that happens after 2450 BC when everything switches to the red continental DNA. So this looks like a really clear picture, but we've got a bit of a gap here. If you notice, there's very, very few samples from after 3000 BC. And in fact, we've got a complete lack of samples from the period running up to 2500 BC. And that's because people are doing something with their dead that means they are not preserved archaeologically. It's quite likely that people are cremating their dead, perhaps putting the remains into rivers or the sea. And that means that we just don't have the DNA surviving from this period. Around about 3000 BC, people are cremating their dead and burying them in some places like Stonehenge, but of course cremation is not cremation is basically destroys the DNA within bones, so it's not possible to get DNA, ancient DNA, from cremated remains. So we've got a bit of an issue here in this lack of samples. And also, if you can see that there is some blue Neolithic ancestry does survive, and in fact it comes back quite strongly around about 2000 BC. So that does suggest that people with Neolithic ancestry are still surviving and still ending up with their DNA being incorporated into people who are born a couple of hundred years later. So actually what we have is that what we're looking at isn't a wholesale switch in the population, in the people, but what we've got is very visible funerary rites, those individual burials like the Amesbury Archer. And we've got fairly invisible funerary rites. And that makes it look like the change is much more distinct and dramatic than it actually was. I've put a reference here to this paper by Tom Booth and Joe Brook, just because it's kind of interesting if you want to follow it up. But basically what we have in this period, and what these people have shown, is that we've got two parallel populations living in the Stonehenge landscape. We've got people who are quite closely related to each other. So, for example, uncles and cousins and daughters and fathers, buried in those barrow cemeteries, which are in the Stonehenge landscape. But they're only really intermarrying and having children among their own kind. So they're only kind of, they're not mixing genetically, they're not having children with the local Neolithic population, who are presumably still around somewhere and presumably burying their dead in the same way as they were before, the cremated remains, perhaps in rivers and things. So we've got this period of about 200, 300 years when we've in essence got two distinct populations. And after that, they start to integrate much more. Now I'm going to tell this story again, but from the perspective of the Dorchester Monument Complex in Dorset, which is another of the areas I've been doing lots of research in. So I'm going to take you through the story of the monument complex here, a bit like I did with Stonehenge. We've got a similar story in the early Neolithic, when we have a causewayed enclosure at a site called Maiden Castle, as you can see in this reconstruction here, which is later overlain by a large linear bank barrow, a long barrow in effect, but very long barrow. We've got some settlement and we've got some other long barrows down in the river valley. This is the confluence of two rivers that you can see here. We've got some settlements, so some pits down here, which have got some lovely artifacts like this flint axe. And again, in the Middle Neolithic, very similar to the Stonehenge landscape, we don't have much happening, but we do have the construction of a monument that looks very, very similar to the first earliest phase of Stonehenge. It's known as Flagstone's Monument. Here's an aerial photograph of it when it was excavated in 1986, and a plan of the monument here. You can see it's a circular monument, only half of it has been excavated. A sort of segmented circular structure, very, very similar to that first early phase of Stonehenge. I had a paper about this monument published a couple of days ago in Antiquity, if you would like to have a look at it. We've done a new chronology for this site. This is part of my work of trying to build a biography for these particular monument complexes. And this reconstruction shows you what we think Flagstone's monument might have looked like in the early phase. And we've just created this diagram here that tries to show the similarities between Flagstones and Stonehenge, but also the fact that the dates have come out really differently. So we had expected, because Flagstones is so similar to Stonehenge, that it would come out about the same date. and it's not. It's about 200, maybe 300 years earlier. So that's really exciting. And flagstones is used for burial. The little people that you can see there in the reconstruction are placing a burial into one of the pits. It was used for cremations. There are some adults, cremated adults placed into the ditch segments, and there are also some burials of children. So similar to Stonehenge, where there were the cremated remains buried, we've got some burials here at flagstones too. So they're really similar monuments. It's making me question whether Stonehenge may be dated slightly wrongly at the moment. We need to maybe go and have another look, but otherwise flagstones is sort of an early version or maybe a prototype for what's happening at Stonehenge. Moving on to the late Neolithic, again, there's an explosion of activity here in the Neolithic in Dorchester. So we've got, we've got a large mega henge, huge, great big henge complex at a site called Mount Pleasant. We've got a really large palisaded enclosure, a great big area of land surrounded by standing timber posts. And we've got a henge monument at a site called Maunbury Rings, a smaller henge monument. Mount Pleasant, unfortunately, is still under the plough. I'm sorry for the quality of this photograph. It's an old slide and the sewage works in the background doesn't exactly look very beautiful. But you can see in the crop marks in the field at the bottom, the outlines of the bank and the ditch. The bank is the white chalky area here and here, and then you've got the ditch running around here. You can also see there's a palisade and in a very narrow strip here. This is a series of standing timber posts, and within that you've got a circular monument, which is not very excitingly known as Site 4. Part of my PhD was also to try and get new dates for this site. All of the archive is stored here in Dorset Museum, and so we radiocarbon dated a whole number of antler picks and all kinds of things from the ditch and other aspects to get a really precise chronology for this site. It was excavated in the 1970s, and the kind of things that we were looking for in those archives were the antler picks that were used to dig the ditches so that we can get really precise dates on when it was excavated. This is Mount Pleasant. It's quite a complicated site. It's a ditch and a bank, a huge kind of henge monument, a slightly later palisaded enclosure, and then this really complex concentric timber monument surrounded by its own little ditch, that one called Site 4. There's also a mound called Conker Barrow that's built on the bank, and the aerial photographs seem to suggest some kind of entrance or approach from this direction. This is the results of our dating for that site. So you can see here that the henge monument itself in green here was built first, closely followed by the mound and also the palisade, that timber palisade, roughly the same period. And then we've got the Site 4 ditch, which may be slightly post-dating the actual concentric timber monument. So quite rapidly we have these things being built in succession. And here I've put that period for the first beaker burials, those arrivals, those first beaker using people who arrived shortly afterwards. So you can see, again, like Stonehenge, the first beaker burials are really hot on the heels or immediately after the construction of these major monuments. And there I've just put the dates for when the ditch was dug. So around about 2500 BC, a really similar date to when Stonehenge is constructed, the stone phase. Here's Site 4. This is the concentric timber monument. You can see it under excavation here in the 1970s. It's a concentric timber monument quite similar to Woodhenge and other ones in the Stonehenge landscape. And you can see that the posts are arranged with 4 sort of corridors. And there are some standing stones and standing posts that create a kind of square arrangement here in the middle. So we were able to get dating material from the ditch of this site, but unfortunately there wasn't any material from the standing posts or any remains of charcoal or etc. that would be useful to actually date the site itself. And here's the estimate for when Site 4 was, the ditch was completed, slightly after the main henge. Really interestingly at this site, there was a layer in the ditch about halfway up where there was a lot of broken sarsen stone, and we think that's the stones that were stood in various places around this site that were then broken up and put into the ditch, and that was associated with beaker pottery. So some dismantling of this monument happened around the time that you can see at the bottom there. It's a bit of a broad date, but roughly in the beaker using period. I'll just finish my train of thought there, which is that potentially this is a site where beaker using people are dismantling, or it could even be a case of kind of iconoclasm where people are removing or, you know, completing, finishing, destroying these Neolithic monuments slightly later. So it's a really interesting time with these parallel populations. Is there conflict? Are there debates about how things should be done? How are these monuments seen by the new incoming population? And finally, in Dorchester, there's the Mulberry Rings, which is a really impressive henge monument. It was later used as a Roman amphitheatre and a civil wall fortification, so it survives really well. Excavated in the very beginning of the 20th century, so quite a long time ago. Here's an excavation photograph from that time. You can see the tents, and I always find these early excavation photos fascinating. But when St George Grey excavated the site, he identified a whole series of shafts, so very deep holes that had been dug right down from the bottom of the ditch. And there are estimated 45 of these, and they go down about 8-9 meters, really, really deep holes, into which were placed antler picks, animal bones, pottery, flint artifacts, carved chalk objects, all kinds of things. Really unusual site. It's an example of yet another kind of slightly wacky, really complex site. You know, Stonehenge is hugely complicated in terms of the stones and the joints and the lintels. Avebury is enormous. Mulberry Rings is incredibly deep, and so you get these kind of, it's like a last hurrah. It's like everyone's doing the biggest, best, most complex monuments just right at the end of this period. Here are those shafts and some of the artifacts that were found by St George Grey. Whole antlers, not just antler picks, carved chalk objects, including chalk phalli, which are quite common from this period, and chalk balls. So again, we've done new dating of this site, and we have some new estimates on when exactly this monument was constructed, and it's right in that transition period. It's just when those new people are arriving with the new beaker pots and the new metalwork. But it seems to be a firmly Neolithic monument. None of those artifacts are found here. So if I put all that together, don't worry about reading this, I'm sorry, it's a bit of a small screen. You can see that there's a whole series of occupation and activity and monument building that happens in the early Neolithic, a little tiny bit, flagstones here, the middle Neolithic flagstones. Then there's a huge gap. This is about 600 or 700 years before again we get a big explosion of activity happening right at the end of the Neolithic period. So part of my work has been trying to build these detailed chronologies so we can see what's going on at these monument complexes. And actually the gaps are just as interesting as the time when all the monuments are being constructed. What is happening here that means that people stop building really large monuments? They're still frequenting the area, but they're not necessarily having major communal building projects. And then of course from this period onwards, again, these large monuments don't get built anymore. And here's the detail for the late Neolithic period at Dorchester. So you can see the sequence in which these different things are constructed. And again, I've just put the beaker dates there. So we can see that, you know, but they're coming in just at the end, just at when all of this activity ceases. That's the beakers. Yeah, so that's the probability there that that red period is probably when the first beaker burials and things like the Amesbury Archer. So to summarize, why do we get this frenzy of building around about 2500 BC? This is I've shown you Dorchester and I've shown you the Stonehenge complexes, but this is actually something that's found across Britain and Ireland, that there's lots and lots of building that happens in around 2500 BC in Ireland and in Scotland and at a lot of the different complexes. So why on earth it seems like there's a crescendo, a kind of frenzy of building, and then it's just on the cusp of when all of these changes start to happen. So I've got two ideas. Other people might have other ways of interpreting this period. One idea is that people knew that change was coming. People in continental Europe had been using copper for quite some time, and it's possible that people started to arrive, and of course they've got to have died and been decided to be buried here. So there could be people coming and going. People perhaps knew that there were new technologies, new beliefs, new languages, new ways of doing things that were seen as a bit of a threat, a bit of a way that they, felt that their way of life was under threat. And perhaps they kind of knuckled down and built bigger and better and more complex and more impressive monuments to sort of speak to their gods or their religious beliefs and sort of, defend themselves from this new way of living. So that's one idea. The other idea is that perhaps there was a building frenzy and that it was just a kind of religious fervor, and this involved perhaps competition between people living in different parts of the country, and perhaps that this building frenzy gets a bit out of hand and there's some kind of resistance, or there's some kind of downing of tools or rebellion where people go, actually, I'm not going to spend my entire life slaving away to build Stonehenge. These projects are just enormous. They would have dominated the lives of people. People would have been planning the contributions to the feasts. People would have been involved in dragging stones over these long distances, setting them up, and back-breaking work, making the stones into shape. So maybe there's something about that causes a bit of a collapse, that the people decide that actually maybe this isn't what they want to do, that the elites perhaps that are in charge are not the people they should be listening to. So perhaps there's something happens which then creates a vacuum into which new people with their beaker pots and with their early metal can finally arrive, there's this sort of vacuum of power in effect where it's right for people to come in and start to change their ways and start to adopt all these new things. So there may be many other ways of thinking about this, but for me, this is a really interesting period where you've got migration and you've got huge building projects, and it's a really interesting period of prehistory. By constructing really detailed chronologies, doing the work that I'm trying to do, which is really detailed radiocarbon dating of some of the monuments, we can start to build a picture of this really intensive and interesting period of prehistory. Thank you very much for listening.